You climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill as the sun sets over Rome. You are a senator, a man whose family has served the Republic and Empire for generations. The golden invitation in your hand should be an honor, a private dinner with Emperor Caligula himself. But your hands are trembling, because you know what happens at these gatherings. Everyone knows. The whispers have been circulating through Rome's elite for months. Servants speak in hushed tones. Guards refuse to meet your eyes as you pass. You know what the emperor has become. And still, you climb. Because to refuse the invitation is to die. Because your family's survival depends on your compliance. Because in Caligula's Rome, there is no choice that doesn't end in horror. If you're intrigued by these dark corners of history, I'd appreciate if you'd subscribe and drop a like on this video, and please comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It amazes me that we can connect across continents, all of us drawn together by curiosity about the past that shaped our present. This is the story of how one emperor transformed the center of Roman power into a theater of sexual terror, how absolute authority became absolute corruption, and how the trauma inflicted within these palace walls would scar an empire for generations. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was born in 12 CE, the son of Rome's beloved General Germanicus. As a child on the Rhine frontier, soldiers dressed him in miniature military gear, complete with tiny caligae, the studded boots of legionnaires. They called him Caligula, Little Boots. It was affectionate then. It would become a name spoken in whispers and dread. But childhood in the imperial family was no fairy tale. By age 7, Caligula's father was dead, likely poisoned by Emperor Tiberius. His mother Agrippina was dragged into exile and starved to death. His 2 older brothers disappeared into prisons where they died by starvation and execution. Of 6 siblings, only Caligula and his 3 sisters survived the purge. The boy learned to survive by becoming invisible. He smiled at the emperor who had murdered his family. He showed no ambition, no anger, no hint of the rage burning inside him. When Tiberius summoned teenage Caligula to his private island of Capri, a place already infamous for the old emperor's perversions, the young man went willingly. What happened during those years, historians could only hint at. But Caligula learned a crucial lesson. Absolute power without limits was the only power worth having. When Tiberius died in March 37th CE, 24-year-old Caligula became emperor. Rome erupted in celebration. Here was the son of beloved Germanicus, come to rescue them from Tiberius's paranoid tyranny. For 7 months, their faith seemed justified. Caligula recalled exiles, distributed bonuses, held magnificent games. The people adored him. Then, in October 37th CE, the emperor fell violently ill. Ancient sources describe brain fever so severe that Rome prepared for his death. The Senate made extraordinary vows. One senator publicly swore to become a gladiator if the gods spared Caligula. Another vowed to sacrifice his own life. Caligula survived. But the man who emerged from that sick room was not the man who had entered it. Within weeks, he forced the first senator to fight in the arena for public entertainment. He drove the second to suicide, demanding he honor his vow. These weren't acts of a grateful survivor. They were opening moves in a campaign of systematic terror. But it was behind palace walls that the true transformation revealed itself. The imperial palace sprawled across the Palatine Hill, a labyrinth of marble corridors and ceremonial halls where the empire's administrative machinery operated day and night. It was here that Caligula began his experiments in degradation. The transformation was methodical. The emperor ordered renovations, redesigning private chambers to serve new purposes. Traditional furniture was removed, replaced with couches arranged in concentric circles for maximum visibility from multiple angles. One room was reconfigured like a small amphitheater, with raised platforms surrounding a central area. When questioned, Caligula smiled and said he was creating spaces for new forms of entertainment. The entertainments began with dinner parties for senators and their families, gatherings that started with traditional protocols, formal toasts, political discussions. But as evening progressed and wine flowed, the emperor would begin making requests. A senator's wife asked to sit beside Caligula instead of her husband. A daughter summoned to pour the emperor's wine. Innocent enough on the surface. But everyone understood these were not requests. They were commands, and they were only the beginning. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, married to Caligula's sister Drusilla, was among the first to experience the full scope. At a private banquet, Caligula turned to him and announced he wished to test Lepidus's loyalty. Then he gestured toward Drusilla. "Your wife has such grace," the emperor said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "I wonder if you would share her with me tonight, as proof of your devotion." The room froze. Drusilla stared at her brother in disbelief. Lepidus understood with terrible clarity that any answer would be wrong. To refuse was treason. To agree was to participate in an act that violated every Roman concept of marriage and honor. He chose survival, as did Drusilla, as they all would again and again in the months that followed. The pattern, once established, accelerated. Caligula began summoning senators' wives to private audiences, ostensibly to discuss their husbands' careers. These women, raised in strict moral codes, trained from birth to embody virtue, found themselves trapped in chambers where refusal meant death for their entire families. One woman, Annia Thrasilla, wife of a praetorian tribune, was known throughout Rome for her virtue. When the imperial summons came, her husband begged her to comply. She went to the palace and didn't return until dawn. When she arrived home, she spoke not a word. 3 days later, she opened her veins in her bath. Her husband survived her by 2 months before drinking poison. But Caligula wasn't satisfied with private encounters. He understood that true domination required witnesses, required the public humiliation of Rome's most powerful men. Dinner parties evolved into mandatory events where the evening's entertainment might include the emperor summoning a senator's wife to perform sexual acts while her husband continued dining, expected to maintain normal conversation as if nothing extraordinary were occurring. Senator Gaius Piso experienced this during a banquet in spring of 39 CE. The evening had been proceeding normally when Caligula suddenly addressed Piso's wife, Livia Oxalina, asking her to sit beside him. The emperor began stroking her arm while discussing grain imports from Egypt. Then, without warning, Caligula stood, took her hand, and announced, "I'm going to discover whether Senator Piso's wife is as accomplished in private as she appears in public." He led her into an adjacent chamber. The door remained open. The sounds that emerged over the next hour were clearly audible to everyone in the dining hall. Piso sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped his wine cup. Other guests maintained desperate pretense of normal conversation, while the emperor's grunts and Livia's occasional sobs echoed from the next room. When Caligula returned, he announced his assessment to the assembled senators. "Senator Piso, you are fortunate. Your wife is adequately skilled, though I've known better." Then he sat down and resumed eating. Livia returned to her place, her face a mask, her eyes fixed on the table. Piso reached for her hand, but she pulled away. They never touched again. Within a year they had divorced quietly, both broken beyond repair. They could not look away. This became the defining horror. Not just that these acts occurred, but that witnesses were required, that observation was mandatory. The emperor was deconstructing Rome's social fabric, one humiliation at a time. Caligula developed elaborate protocols. Certain senators were assigned specific roles, forced to participate not as victims but as facilitators of others' humiliation. They were required to prepare women for the emperor's attention, to physically position bodies for sexual acts, to provide commentary during performances. This forced complicity was perhaps more psychologically destructive than direct victimization. One senator, Lucius Vitellius, became one of Caligula's most enthusiastic enablers, personally recruiting women for imperial gatherings. His willing participation bought him favor and spared his own wife and daughters from direct abuse, but it earned him a reputation that would haunt him forever. Other senators could claim they were forced. Vitellius had chosen collaboration over honor. The emperor's demands extended beyond aristocracy to religious institutions. Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to 30 years of celibacy whose purity was believed essential to Rome's prosperity, were forced to attend palace gatherings where they witnessed sexual acts that violated their sacred vows. These women, who had devoted their lives to embodying purity, were transformed into spectators at orgies, their presence making them participants through observation. Traditional religious festivals were corrupted. The Lupercalia, an ancient fertility celebration, was transformed into a mandatory sexual gathering where senators' wives were required to participate in public intercourse as offerings to the gods. Caligula declared himself chief priest of these ceremonies, claiming divine authority for acts that would have been considered sacrilege under any previous emperor. The economic dimension revealed itself gradually. Access to women from prominent families could be sold, creating a grotesque marketplace where political favor was exchanged for sexual services. Senators seeking lucrative provincial governorships learned their applications would be viewed more favorably if accompanied by offers of female relatives for the emperor's pleasure. The case of Valerius Asiaticus illustrates how completely this infected Roman society. Among the wealthiest men in Rome, his wife Poppaea Sabina was celebrated for her beauty and intelligence. When Asiaticus sought to purchase estates the emperor wanted, Caligula sent a message. He would look more favorably on Asiaticus's bid if Poppaea spent time at the palace as a gesture of friendship. Asiaticus chose business over his wife's dignity. Poppaea spent 6 weeks in palace residence, officially as a cultural consultant, actually as one of several women available for the emperor's sexual use. When she returned, their marriage was destroyed. Poppaea would eventually take her own life years later. Ancient sources suggest she never recovered from those 6 weeks. Children couldn't be shielded from the palace's corruption. Young boys and girls were brought to gatherings, officially to learn social conduct, actually to be exposed to sexual activities no child should witness. One account describes a boy of perhaps 12, son of a military tribune, required to stand beside the emperor's couch during an orgy and provide explicit commentary on what he observed. The purpose was clear: to corrupt the child's development, to normalize degradation, to create the next generation who would view abuse as simply how power operated. Palace servants existed in constant terror. Young male slaves were summoned to the emperor's chambers with no possibility of refusal. Female servants faced the emperor prowling corridors at night, selecting women arbitrarily for immediate use. Some attempted suicide. Others tried to escape, though fleeing imperial service was itself a capital offense. By late 40 CE, the palace had become something unprecedented. The administrative center of empire had been transformed into a theater of systematic sexual abuse operating on multiple levels. Aristocratic victims coming and going from mandatory gatherings. Long-term captives held in chambers as permanent sexual slaves. Children being systematically corrupted. Religious institutions forced to desecrate their own principles. An economic system trading human bodies for political favors. They could not look away. This was the genius of Caligula's system. Forced witnessing created particular trauma. Making observers complicit destroyed their capacity for moral judgment and resistance. Every senator who watched his colleague's wife being abused became less capable of organizing opposition. The corruption was collective, systematic, designed to paralyze the entire elite class. The conspiracy that ended Caligula's reign in January 41 CE was motivated by more than politics. Several key conspirators, including Cassius Chaerea, who struck the first blow, had been personally victimized or watched family members destroyed. When they trapped Caligula in underground passages and stabbed him 30 times, they were taking revenge for violations that could never be publicly acknowledged. The new Emperor Claudius faced extraordinary challenges. Physical evidence was extensive. Rooms equipped for sexual torture, collections of obscene artwork depicting real victims, detailed records serving as blackmail material. Much was quietly destroyed to spare victims further humiliation. Viewing galleries were dismantled, specialized chambers completely renovated, records burned. The historical record itself became cover-up. Ancient historians documented Caligula's crimes but used careful, coded language. This discretion, while well-intentioned, allowed later generations to minimize or dismiss accounts as exaggeration. But convergence of multiple independent sources, physical modifications archaeological evidence confirms, and patterns consistent with modern understanding of trauma suggest ancient sources understated, rather than exaggerated what occurred. The silence of victims themselves is perhaps most tragic. Roman codes made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly. Women who had been abused faced a society that would blame them. Men forced to watch their wives' degradation couldn't discuss it without admitting helplessness. Children carried trauma privately, understanding that speaking would only mark them as damaged. The Palatine Palace still stands in ruins. Tourists photograph fallen columns and mosaic fragments, marveling at Roman engineering. Tour guides point out rooms where emperors met with senators, where state decisions were made. They rarely mention what else happened: how marble floors were scrubbed each morning, how underground passages removed victims who had broken completely, how certain chambers had been so specifically engineered for sexual abuse they served no other function. The emperor who turned his palace into an orgy reigned less than 4 years. But the patterns he established, the understanding that sexual abuse could be weaponized as political control, the systematic corruption of an entire civilization's elite through forced participation in degradation, these lessons were not forgotten. They would resurface throughout Roman history in reigns of Nero, Domitian, and Elagabalus. The horror isn't just that these acts occurred. Abuse happens in every era. The horror is how methodically it was organized, how consciously weaponized, how effectively it corrupted not just individuals, but the entire social and political structure of the world's most powerful empire. The horror is that it worked. For 4 years, systematic sexual abuse kept Rome's elite paralyzed, unable to organize resistance, trapped between compliance or annihilation. What destroyed Caligula wasn't moral outrage or popular rebellion. It was a desperate violence of a few men pushed beyond endurance who chose to die while striking back. Their knives ended one emperor's terror. They couldn't undo the trauma inflicted, couldn't restore innocence destroyed, couldn't heal wounds carved into Rome's collective psyche. The ruins remember, even if we choose not to listen. In stones where senators' wives waited to be summoned. In underground passages where victims were carried away. In silence that covers this history like dust covering blood. They could not look away, and neither should we, because the mechanisms of sexual terrorism Caligula perfected did not die with him. They persist wherever absolute power operates without accountability, wherever victims are silenced by shame and fear, wherever trauma passes through generations who never speak its name but carry it nonetheless. An inheritance of suffering embedded in silence that echoes across 2,000 years.